The words hung in the air like broken glass, sharp enough to cut through 20 years of silence. Victoria Ashworth, CEO of Ashworth Industries, stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor, staring down at the man mopping her marble floors. Her manicured fingers trembled against the mahogany desk as she watched him work with the same quiet precision he'd shown every night for the past 6 months. David Chen. No, that wasn't right. David. Something. She'd never bothered to learn his last name. But tonight, everything would change. Tonight, she would ask this stranger to pretend to love her, and what he would do in response would leave everyone, including herself, absolutely stunned. The fluorescent lights of the Ashworth Industries building cast long shadows across the empty hallways as David Murphy pushed his cleaning cart down the corridor. It was past 11 p.m., and the corporate warriors had long since retreated to their suburban fortresses, leaving behind nothing but coffee stains and crumpled papers as evidence of their daily battles. David preferred it this way. The silence, the solitude, the honest work that asked nothing of him but his presence. At 52, David had learned to find peace in the rhythm of simple tasks. The steady swish of the mop, the gentle hum of the vacuum, the satisfaction of transforming chaos into order. His weathered hands, scarred from years of manual labor, moved with practiced efficiency as he cleaned each office with the same care he once used to fix broken toys for his daughter, Emma. Emma. Even thinking her name sent a familiar ache through his chest. 18 now, a freshman at Northwestern University studying engineering, just like her mother had dreamed. The scholarship money was tight, but David had promised Sarah on her deathbed that their daughter would get the education they'd never had. Every night shift, every weekend of overtime, every missed dinner was worth it to keep that promise alive. The elevator dinged softly as David stepped inside, pressing the button for the 42nd floor. Executive territory. This was where the real power lived, where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made behind closed doors and floor-to-ceiling windows. David had cleaned these offices for 6 months now, invisible to the men and women who ruled their corporate kingdom. He preferred it that way. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant uncomplicated. The executive floor was a monument to success. Marble floors that reflected the city lights, oil paintings worth more than David's annual salary, and furniture that whispered of old money and older power. At the center of it all sat Victoria Ashworth's corner office, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of downtown Chicago. David had saved it for last, as he always did, partly because it required the most time, and partly because something about the space unsettled him. Victoria Ashworth was a legend in the business world. At 38, she had built Ashworth Industries from a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Forbes had called her the Iron Woman of Tech, and Fortune had named her one of the most powerful women in America 3 years running. She was brilliant, ruthless, and completely untouchable. David had seen her exactly twice in 6 months, once stepping out of a black town car, and once standing at her office window, silhouetted against the city lights like a general surveying a battlefield. Tonight, however, the battlefield looked different. Papers were scattered across her usually pristine desk, and a half-empty bottle of wine sat next to a crystal glass that had seen better nights. David knocked gently on the doorframe, a habit he'd developed out of respect, even though he'd never encountered anyone this late. "Come in," the voice startled him. Victoria Ashworth sat in her chair, facing the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She didn't turn around, but David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the armrests like anchors. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ashworth. I didn't know you were still here. I can come back later." David's voice was quiet, respectful. The voice of a man who understood his place in the hierarchy. "No." She turned then, and David was struck by how different she looked from the polished executive he'd seen in photographs. Her designer suit was wrinkled, her makeup smudged, and her eyes held the exhaustion that went deeper than a long day at the office. "Please, stay. I need—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "I need to ask you something." David remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. In his experience, when powerful people needed something from invisible people, it was usually simple. Work an extra shift, clean up a mess, pretend you didn't see or hear something. He was prepared for any of those requests. "What's your name?" Victoria asked, and David blinked in surprise. In 6 months, no one on the executive floor had ever asked him that question. "David Murphy, ma'am." "David." She repeated it slowly, as if testing how it felt in her mouth. "Do you have children, David?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes, ma'am. A daughter. Emma. She's 18. Victoria nodded, something flickering across her face. "I have a son. Marcus. He's 8. She stood and walked to the window, her reflection merging with the city lights. "His father and we divorced 2 years ago. Messy, public, the kind of thing that ends up in the business section of the Tribune." David remained silent, unsure why she was sharing this with him, but sensing that interruption would be unwelcome. "There's a company party tomorrow night, the annual Ashworth Industries gala. 500 of Chicago's most influential people, all watching, all judging." She turned back to face him, and David saw something desperate in her eyes. "Marcus will be there. He'll be watching me, looking for signs that I'm okay, that his mother isn't the cold, heartless corporate machine everyone says she is." David began to understand where this conversation was heading, and the understanding made his stomach tighten. "I need someone to accompany me to this gala, David. Someone to play the role of someone who cares about me, someone who sees past the title and the money and the reputation." Her voice was steady, but David could hear the tremor underneath. "I need someone to pretend to love me." The words hung between them like a challenge, and David felt the weight of his ordinary life pressing against the extraordinary request. This was the moment when invisible people were supposed to remain invisible, when the safe response was to politely decline and return to the comfort of cleaning supplies and uncomplicated routines. But something in Victoria Ashworth's eyes reminded him of Emma, of the way his daughter had looked when she'd asked him to attend her high school graduation, even though it meant missing a day's pay. Sometimes the most important moments required stepping out of the shadows, even when it felt impossible. "Ma'am," David said quietly, "I'm just a janitor. I don't know anything about galas or corporate parties. I don't own a tuxedo, and I've never—" He gestured helplessly at the opulent office around them. "I don't belong in your world." Victoria's smile was sad and knowing. "Neither do I, David. Neither do I." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 2 very different lives suddenly intersecting. David thought about Emma, about the promises he'd made, about the scholarship money that barely covered her expenses. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always said that kindness was the most important currency in the world, worth more than money or status or safety. "If I said yes," David said slowly, "what exactly would I need to do?" Victoria's eyes widened slightly, as if she'd expected an immediate refusal. "Accompany me to the gala. Smile when people are watching. Dance with me during the slow songs. Make small talk about normal things. Help my son see that his mother is capable of being loved by someone genuine. And after the party? After the party, you go back to your life, and I go back to mine. No complications, no ongoing obligations, Just one night of pretending that Victoria Ashworth is someone worth loving. David studied her face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. What he saw instead was a mother's desperation, the same desperation he'd felt countless times when Emma needed something he couldn't provide. The difference was that Victoria Ashworth had the power to buy almost anything, except authenticity, except genuine human connection, except someone who would see her as more than a title or a bank account. "All right," David said, and the word seemed to surprise both of them. "I'll do it." Victoria's relief was immediate and profound, like a dam bursting after years of pressure. "Thank you. I'll have my assistant arrange for a tuxedo, and I'll brief you on the guest list and—" She paused, studying his face. "Why did you say yes, David?" David considered the question, thinking about Emma and Sarah and the promises that shaped his life. "Because sometimes people need help, and if I can help, then I should. It's as simple as that." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and David had the strange feeling that she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. "Nothing about this is simple, David. You have no idea what you're walking into." "Maybe not," David agreed. "But my daughter taught me that doing the right thing is rarely simple. It's just necessary." As David left the office that night, pushing his cleaning cart toward the elevator, he had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both of their lives forever. He didn't know about Victoria's ex-husband Richard, who was planning to use the gala to challenge her custody of Marcus. He didn't know about the board of directors who were looking for any excuse to question her leadership. He didn't know about the reporters who would be watching every interaction, every gesture, every moment of apparent vulnerability. All David knew was that a mother needed help protecting her child's image of her, and that was a request he couldn't refuse. After all, wasn't that what parents did? Wasn't that what love looked like? The willingness to step outside your comfort zone to protect the people who mattered most? The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying David back down to the ordinary world of night shifts and cleaning supplies. But tomorrow night, for just a few hours, he would step into a world of crystal chandeliers and $1,000 suits, armed with nothing but his genuine heart, and a promise to help a mother show her son that she was worthy of love. Neither David nor Victoria could have predicted that this simple arrangement would become something much more complicated, much more dangerous, and ultimately much more transformative than either of them had imagined. The gala was supposed to be an ending, one night of pretense to solve an immediate problem. Instead, it would become a beginning, the first chapter in a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about the true nature of love and worth in a world that too often confused price with value. The cleaning cart squeaked softly as David pushed it through the empty hallways, but his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow night, to the moment when the invisible man would step into the spotlight and discover that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Little did he know that by the end of the following evening, the question wouldn't be whether he could convincingly pretend to love Victoria Ashworth, but whether he could convincingly pretend that he didn't. The next day arrived with the weight of unspoken possibilities. David had called in sick to his regular job at the warehouse, the first time he'd taken a personal day in 3 years, to prepare for an evening that felt as surreal as landing on the moon. Victoria's assistant, a efficient woman named Margaret, had delivered a perfectly fitted tuxedo to his modest apartment in Rogers Park, along with an engraved invitation and a brief note in Victoria's handwriting. "Remember, David, tonight we're helping a little boy believe in love. Thank you for making this possible." The apartment David shared with his memories felt smaller than usual as he prepared for the gala. Every corner held reminders of Sarah, her coffee mug still in the dish drainer, her favorite novel bookmarked on the nightstand, the family photo from Emma's high school graduation, where the three of them looked genuinely happy, despite everything they'd been through. Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, lost to cancer despite every prayer and every sacrifice David could make. But her presence still filled the space like sunlight through gauze curtains. "What do you think, sweetheart?" David asked the photograph as he adjusted his bow tie for the 5th time. "Am I completely out of my mind?" Sarah's smile seemed to answer him from across the years. "You're doing what you always do, David Murphy. You're helping someone who needs it, even when it scares you." The Ashworth Industries gala was being held at the Palmer House Hilton, a testament to Chicago's gilded age that seemed appropriate for an evening designed around appearances and influence. David arrived precisely at 7 p.m., as instructed, feeling like an actor who'd been given a script in a foreign language. The tuxedo fit perfectly, but it felt like a costume, a disguise that transformed him from invisible janitor to… what exactly? Victoria was waiting in the hotel lobby, and David's breath caught when he saw her. Gone was the exhausted executive from the night before, replaced by a woman who embodied power and elegance in equal measure. Her midnight blue gown complemented her auburn hair, which was swept up in a style that made her look both regal and approachable. Diamond earrings caught the light as she turned toward him, and for a moment David understood why Forbes called her a force of nature. "You clean up well, David Murphy," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine despite the formal setting. "Thank you, ma'am. You look…" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound inappropriate coming from a janitor to a billionaire. "You look like someone any little boy would be proud to call his mother." Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a softening around her eyes that suggested his words had hit their intended mark. "That's exactly what I needed to hear. Are you ready for this?" David offered her his arm, a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. "As ready as I'll ever be." The grand ballroom of the Palmer House was a vision of old-world opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble columns, while 500 of Chicago's most influential citizens mingled beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds. The who's who of business, politics, and society filled the space with the low murmur of conversations worth millions of dollars and the gentle clink of champagne glasses raised in toasts to success and influence. David had expected to feel overwhelmed, intimidated by the sheer weight of accumulated power and wealth. Instead, he found himself studying the faces around him with the same attention he brought to his cleaning work. Beneath the designer gowns and perfectly knotted ties, he saw the same fundamental humanity he encountered everywhere. Parents worried about their children, spouses trying to impress each other, individuals seeking connection and validation in a world that often felt impersonal and cold. "There's Marcus," Victoria whispered, nodding toward a corner where a small boy in a miniature tuxedo stood, talking animatedly with an elderly woman. "That's his grandmother, Richard's mother. Well, she's never approved of me." David studied the child. 8 years old, with his mother's intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the space around him. Marcus was gesturing excitedly as he spoke, clearly comfortable in social situations, in a way that suggested natural charisma rather than forced performance. This was Victoria's son, the little boy for whom she was willing to risk her carefully constructed facade of corporate invincibility. "He looks like you," David observed. "Same determined expression when he's making a point." Victoria's smile was soft and proud. "He wants to be an astronaut this week. Last month it was a marine biologist. Before that, a professional baseball player." She paused, watching her son with the intensity that only parents understand. "I love that he still believes he can be anything he wants to be." Why wouldn't he? David asked, and Victoria turned to look at him with surprise. Because he's growing up in a world where his mother is called the Iron Woman by the business press. Because his father tells him that success means never showing weakness. Because everyone he meets wants something from our family. Her voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. I'm afraid he's learning that love is conditional, that people only value you for what you can give them. David thought about Emma, about the scholarship struggles and the second-hand clothes and the nights when he'd worried that he wasn't providing enough. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for, he said quietly. They know the difference between real love and the kind that comes with strings attached. Marcus looks at you like you hung the moon, Mrs. Ashworth. That doesn't happen unless a child feels genuinely loved. Before Victoria could respond, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit approached them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. David recognized him immediately from the business pages of the Tribune. Richard Ashworth, Victoria's ex-husband, and the man who'd tried to destroy her reputation during their very public divorce. "Victoria, darling," Richard said, his smile as sharp as a knife blade. "You look lovely this evening, and this must be your companion for the evening?" David felt Victoria's arm tense against his, but her expression remained perfectly composed. "Richard, I'd like you to meet David Murphy. David, this is Marcus's father, Richard Ashworth." Richard extended his hand with the mechanical precision of a politician, his eyes assessing David with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Murphy, is it? And what business are you in, David?" This was the moment David had been dreading, the inevitable question that would expose the vast gulf between his world and theirs. He could feel the attention of nearby guests beginning to focus on their conversation, could sense the subtle shift that indicated gossip in the making. In the business world, Victoria Ashworth's choice of companion would be analyzed, dissected, and judged with the same intensity as a quarterly earnings report. "I work nights," David said simply, meeting Richard's gaze without flinching. "Maintenance and cleaning services." The silence that followed was deafening. David could see Richard's surprise transform into something approaching delight, as if he'd been handed an unexpected gift. Several nearby conversations paused as the implications of David's revelation rippled outward through the crowd. "How refreshing," Richard said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Victoria always did have such interesting taste in projects. The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to diminish both David and Victoria while maintaining plausible deniability. David felt anger flash through him. Not at being dismissed, which he'd expected, but at the casual cruelty directed toward Victoria. This was her ex-husband, the father of her child, and he was using David's presence as a weapon to embarrass her in front of Chicago's elite. "Actually," David said, his voice calm and steady, "I think Mrs. Ashworth's taste is pretty remarkable. She's built one of the most successful companies in the country, she's raising an incredible son, and she has the courage to be herself in a room full of people who are probably too busy performing to remember who they really are." Richard's expression shifted, the predatory confidence faltering slightly in the face of David's unexpected directness. "How philosophical of you." "Not philosophical," David replied. "Just honest. I've learned that the people worth knowing are usually the ones who don't need to prove how important they are." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in the center of the ballroom. David had just challenged Richard Ashworth, and by extension, half the room, in the most polite possible way. It was a moment that would be remembered, discussed, and analyzed in Chicago's social circles for weeks to come. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened, but when David glanced at her, he saw something unexpected in her eyes. pride. Not embarrassment, not horror at his presumption, but genuine pride in his refusal to be intimidated or diminished. "Well," Richard said, his smile becoming even more artificial, "I can see why you two make such an interesting couple. Marcus will certainly have some fascinating dinner conversation tonight." "Speaking of Marcus," Victoria said smoothly, "I should introduce David. Excuse us, Richard." As they walked away, David could feel the weight of 100 conversations shifting to analyze what had just occurred. He'd expected to feel regret, to worry that he'd made Victoria's situation worse by refusing to play the role of the grateful, subservient working man. Instead, he felt oddly liberated, as if he'd remembered something important about himself that he'd temporarily forgotten. "Uncle David!" Marcus's voice cut through the ambient conversation like a bell, clear and delighted. The 8-year-old broke away from his grandmother and rushed toward them with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only children possess. "Mom said you were coming tonight." David froze, confusion washing over him like cold water. "Uncle David?" He looked at Victoria, who had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. This wasn't part of the plan they'd discussed. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested their connection ran deeper than a random arrangement between a desperate mother and a helpful janitor. "Marcus, sweetheart," Victoria said carefully. "I think you might be confused. This is David Murphy, my friend for the evening." But Marcus was shaking his head with the absolute certainty that only children possess when adults are wrong about something important. "No, Mom, this is Uncle David, the one from the pictures, the one Dad always talks about." His 8-year-old eyes moved between David and his mother with growing confusion. "Don't you remember? You used to tell me stories about him when I was little." The ballroom seemed to fade around them as David stared at the child who somehow knew him, who called him uncle with the familiarity of long relationship. Behind Marcus, Richard's grandmother was approaching with an expression of dawning recognition that sent ice through David's veins. This elegant woman in her 70s, this pillar of Chicago society, was looking at him as if she'd seen a ghost. "Dear God," the older woman whispered, her voice carrying decades of carefully buried secrets. "David Chen, after all these years." David Chen. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back through 25 years of deliberately forgotten memories. David Chen, the engineering student at Northwestern who'd been Victoria's study partner, her closest friend, The rest of the memory crashed over him with devastating clarity. Victoria hadn't been Victoria Ashworth then. She'd been Victoria Chen, his younger sister, the brilliant girl who'd followed her older brother to university with dreams of changing the world. Victoria, his sister. The sister he'd walked away from 25 years ago after a fight so bitter, so final, that they'd both chosen to pretend the other had ceased to exist. The sister who'd built an empire while he'd worked with his hands, who'd married into Chicago society while he'd fallen in love with a nurse named Sarah. The sister whose wedding invitation he'd torn up without reading, whose son he'd never met, whose life he'd deliberately avoided learning about even when her name appeared in the business sections of every newspaper in the city. "You changed your name," Victoria whispered, and David could hear 25 years of grief and anger and loss in those 4 words. "So did you," he replied, his voice barely audible above the orchestra that had begun playing dinner music. "Ashworth, you took his name." The recognition was spreading through their immediate vicinity like ripples in a pond. Richard's grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, was staring at them both with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that had troubled her for years. Several board members of Ashworth Industries were beginning to take notice, their conversations pausing as they sensed drama unfolding in their midst. "Mom, Marcus looked between the two adults with growing concern. Why does everyone look scared? Why is Grandma Eleanor smiling like that? Victoria knelt down to her son's level, her hands trembling slightly as she touched his face. Marcus, honey, there are some things about our family that I haven't told you yet. This is your Uncle David, your real uncle, my brother. We haven't seen each other in a very long time. But why? Marcus asked with the devastating directness of childhood. If he's family, why doesn't he come to Christmas? Why haven't I met him before? The question hung in the air like an indictment, and David felt the weight of 25 years of stubborn pride and unforgiving anger settling on his shoulders. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes adults make choices that seem reasonable at the time, but grow more senseless with each passing year? How could he tell Marcus that he'd thrown away his relationship with his sister over a fight so ancient that he could barely remember what had started it? Because your uncle and I had a disagreement a long time ago, Victoria said carefully, and we both let our pride get in the way of our love for each other. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth had moved closer, her sharp eyes gleaming with the predatory intelligence that had made the Ashworth family one of Chicago's most powerful dynasties. How interesting, she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for the growing circle of observers to hear. So the janitor isn't Victoria's boyfriend after all. He's her estranged brother, the one who walked away from the family before Victoria married my son. How illuminating. David could see the trap closing around them with the inexorable precision of a Swiss watch. Richard's mother had just provided the ammunition that Richard himself would need to challenge Victoria's fitness as a mother. A woman so cold, so difficult to love that even her own brother had abandoned her. A woman who was so desperate for companionship that she'd hired her own estranged sibling to play the role of a romantic partner. The custody implications were staggering, and David could see that Victoria understood exactly what was happening. Grandmother Eleanor, Marcus said with 8-year-old diplomacy, you're being mean to my mom and my uncle. Dad says we should be nice to family, even when they make mistakes. The simple rebuke from a child silenced the growing murmur of conversation around them, and David felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room. Here was Marcus, faced with revelations that would confuse most adults, choosing kindness over drama and family over social positioning. Here was the son Victoria had been so worried about, demonstrating wisdom that most of the adults in the room seemed to lack. You're right, Marcus, David said, kneeling down beside Victoria so he was at the boy's eye level. Your grandmother is upset because adults sometimes make things more complicated than they need to be. Your mom and I had a fight a long time ago, and we both said things we didn't mean. Sometimes it takes a smart kid like you to remind us what's really important. So you're really my uncle? Marcus asked, his eyes bright with curiosity rather than confusion. The one who taught Mom how to fix engines when she was little? The one who helped her build the robot for the science fair? David's breath caught. Victoria had told Marcus stories about him. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite 25 years of silence and separation, she'd kept his memory alive for her son. She'd told their child about the brother who'd taught her to solve problems with her hands as well as her mind, who'd encouraged her to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. Yeah, David said softly. I'm that uncle. And your mom was the smartest little sister in the world, even when she was being stubborn. I was not stubborn, Victoria protested, and for a moment her voice carried the echo of the teenage girl she'd once been. I was determined. There's a difference. You were both, David replied, and despite everything, the audience, the implications, the 25 years of lost time, he found himself almost smiling. Stubborn and determined and brilliant and impossible to argue with, even when you were wrong. I wasn't wrong about... Victoria began, then stopped herself, glancing around at the circle of interested faces surrounding them. Whatever they'd fought about all those years ago, this wasn't the time or place to relitigate it. No, David agreed quietly. You weren't wrong. I was. About a lot of things. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible canyon, and David saw something change in Victoria's expression. The defensive corporate mask slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the sister he'd lost, the girl who'd believed in possibility and second chances, and the fundamental goodness of people who loved each other. Well, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth said, with the timing of someone experienced in destroying tender moments, this certainly puts a different spin on the evening, doesn't it? Victoria, dear, you might want to consider how this family reunion will look in tomorrow's society pages. Before Victoria could respond, the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. It was the traditional moment when the evening shifted from networking to celebration, when the business of influence gave way to the theatre of society. David could see Richard approaching through the crowd, his expression suggesting that his mother had already briefed him on the evening's unexpected developments. "Dance with me," Victoria said suddenly, extending her hand to David. "Please, let's give them something to really talk about." David looked at the offered hand, at the sister he'd lost, and found again in the span of 5 minutes at the 8-year-old nephew who was watching with the absolute faith that adults would somehow make everything right. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always said that family was the most important thing, even when family was complicated and painful and imperfect. "I should warn you," David said, taking Victoria's hand. "I learned to dance at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Rogers Park. It's not exactly Palmer House material." "I learned in boarding school," Victoria replied as they moved toward the dance floor. "They taught us to dance with books balanced on our heads. I think your way probably involved more actual fun." As the orchestra began the waltz in earnest, David and Victoria took their places among Chicago's most powerful couples. They moved together with the careful precision of people relearning a rhythm they'd once known by heart, brother and sister, janitor and CEO, two people who'd spent 25 years pretending the other didn't exist. Around them, the whispers began in earnest. The story would be front-page news by morning, the ice queen of Chicago business revealed to be so desperate for companionship that she'd hired her own estranged brother to pose as her boyfriend. The custody implications alone would keep the family law attorneys busy for months. Richard would have everything he needed to challenge Victoria's fitness as a mother, and the board of Ashworth Industries would have legitimate grounds to question her judgment and stability. But as they danced, David found himself remembering the sister who'd sat up all night helping him with calculus homework, who'd believed in his dreams when no one else would, who'd cried when he'd walked away from their family and never looked back. Victoria had built an empire, yes, but she'd also raised a son who chose kindness over gossip and family over social advantage. She'd told that son stories about the uncle who'd loved her, even after that uncle had disappeared from their lives. "I'm sorry," David said, as the waltz carried them past tables full of Chicago's elite. "For everything, for walking away, for staying away, for letting pride matter more than family." "I'm sorry too," Victoria replied, and David could hear the tears she was too disciplined to shed. "For the things I said, for the things I didn't say, for not trying harder to bring you home." "Mom! Uncle David!" Marcus's voice carried across the ballroom as the 8-year-old applauded their dancing with uninhibited enthusiasm. "You look like the people in the movies!" And suddenly David understood what Victoria had been trying to protect. Not her corporate image or her social standing, but her son's faith in the possibility of love, in the idea that the people who mattered most would choose each other despite their flaws and failures and mistakes. Marcus was watching his mother dance with his uncle, seeing family reunited, witnessing forgiveness in action. "Whatever happens after tonight," David said quietly, "whatever Richard does with this information, whatever the newspapers say, I want you to know something." "What?" "I'm proud of you, of everything you've built, everything you've accomplished, the mother you've become. Sarah always said I was an idiot for walking away from my family, and she was right. But seeing Marcus, seeing the man you're raising, Victoria, you didn't just build a business empire, you built something much more important." The waltz was ending, the orchestra drawing the melody to a close, but David and Victoria remained on the dance floor for just a moment longer. Around them, Chicago's most powerful people returned to their tables, their conversations, their endless networking and positioning and maneuvering for advantage. But at the center of it all, a brother and sister held each other's hands and remembered what they'd once meant to each other. "Uncle David," Marcus said as they returned to the table, "are you going to come home with us tonight? Mom always makes hot chocolate after parties, and I could show you my telescope. I'm studying the constellations." David looked at Victoria, seeing the question in her eyes. After 25 years of separation, was it possible to simply return? Could they pick up the pieces of their relationship and build something new from the fragments of what they'd once shared? "I'd like that," David said, and meant it. "But first, we should probably talk to your father. I think he has some questions about tonight." Richard was indeed approaching, flanked by two men David recognized as members of Ashworth Industries' board of directors. Their expressions suggested that the evening's revelations had provided exactly the kind of ammunition they'd been hoping for. A custody challenge would be complicated enough, but a challenge combined with questions about Victoria's judgment as a corporate leader could be devastating. "Victoria," Richard said with false concern, "I think we need to discuss how tonight's developments might affect Marcus's welfare. Perhaps it would be better if he came home with me this evening, just until we can sort out this rather complicated family situation." David felt Victoria stiffen beside him, saw the fear flash across her face at the thought of losing her son. This was what she'd been trying to prevent, the exact scenario that had driven her to ask a stranger to pretend to love her. Except the stranger had turned out to be her brother, and the pretense had become something much more real and much more dangerous. "Actually," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd developed during years of supervising cleaning crews and managing difficult situations, "I think what Marcus needs is to see his family working together instead of fighting. He's had enough disruption for one evening." "And who are you to decide what's best for my son?" Richard demanded, his composure finally cracking. "You're a janitor who's been estranged from this family for decades. What possible authority do you have in this situation?" It was the wrong question to ask in front of Marcus, who looked up at his father with 8-year-old disappointment. "Dad, that's not nice. Uncle David is family, and he has a job, just like you do. Mom says all work is important if you do it well." The simple rebuke from his own son left Richard speechless, and David realized that Marcus was doing more than defending his newfound uncle. The boy was demonstrating the values his mother had taught him, the same values that had driven David to work double shifts to pay for Emma's education, the same values that had motivated Victoria to build a company based on innovation rather than exploitation. "Perhaps," said one of the board members, "we should continue this discussion in a more private setting. The implications for the company's leadership are—" "The implications for the company?" Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the steel that had earned her the nickname Iron Woman, "are that I've demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving and relationship-building skills that have made Ashworth Industries the success it is today. I identified a challenge, developed a creative solution, and executed it flawlessly. The fact that the solution involved reconciling with my brother only proves that I'm capable of the kind of long-term thinking that benefits everyone involved. David admired the way she'd reframed the evening's events, turning a potential disaster into evidence of executive competence. But he could see that the board members weren't entirely convinced, and Richard was already calculating new angles of attack. The question remains, Richard pressed, whether involving Marcus in this performance demonstrates appropriate parental judgment. Actually, David said, I think involving Marcus demonstrates exactly the kind of parental judgment we should all hope for. Everyone turned to look at him, and David realized he was about to either save Victoria's reputation or destroy it completely. Either way, there was no going back. See, here's what I've learned in 25 years of working with people from every walk of life, David continued, his voice steady and clear. The mark of a good parent isn't protecting your kids from every difficult situation. It's teaching them how to handle difficult situations with grace and kindness and integrity. Tonight, Marcus watched his mother take a risk to help him understand that she's worthy of love. He watched his father try to use that risk against her, and he watched a family choose forgiveness over pride. David turned to face Marcus directly. Which lesson do you think he'll remember when he's deciding what kind of man he wants to become? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and David could see its impact rippling through the group. Marcus was indeed watching, learning, forming the foundational memories that would shape his understanding of how families work, how problems get solved, how people who love each other navigate difficult circumstances. I want to go home with Mom, Marcus said quietly. And I want Uncle David to come too. We're family now, right? That's what families do. They stay together. It was perhaps the most profound statement of the evening, delivered with the clarity that only children possess. Marcus had cut through all the legal maneuvering and corporate positioning and social calculation to identify the core truth. Families choose each other, especially when choosing each other is difficult. Richard looked at his son, at his ex-wife, at the brother-in-law he'd never known existed, and David could see the exact moment when the fight went out of him. Whatever Richard had hoped to accomplish tonight, it wasn't worth disappointing his son or looking petty in front of Marcus's newfound uncle. All right, Richard said finally. But Victoria, we will be having a conversation about this, a private conversation about boundaries and communication and what's best for Marcus going forward. Of course, Victoria agreed. Family conversations are important. Right, David? David nodded, understanding that he was being invited back into not just Victoria's life, but into the complicated dynamics of modern family relationships. It wouldn't be simple. Nothing about blended families and custody arrangements and corporate responsibilities ever was. But Marcus was right. This was what families did. They chose each other, they worked through difficult conversations, they created space for forgiveness and growth and second chances. As the gala began to wind down around them, David found himself standing with his sister and nephew, watching Chicago's elite begin their elaborate rituals of departure. Tomorrow, the society pages would indeed have plenty to discuss. The business press would analyze the corporate implications of Victoria's family reunion. The family law attorneys would begin strategizing new approaches to custody negotiations. But tonight, a mother and son were going home together, accompanied by an uncle who'd been missing from their lives for far too long. Tonight, a family was choosing love over pride, forgiveness over resentment, connection over the safe distance of mutual estrangement. Uncle David, Marcus said as they waited for their coats, when we get home, will you tell me what Mom was like when she was little? I want to know all the stories. David looked at Victoria, seeing the sister he'd once known hidden behind the corporate executive she'd become. "I'll tell you about the time your mom built a robot out of old vacuum cleaner parts and entered it in the science fair, and about how she always insisted on fixing her own bicycle, even when Dad offered to take it to the shop, and about how she used to read engineering textbooks for fun when other kids were reading comic books." "She sounds exactly like me," Marcus said with satisfaction. "She sounds exactly like you," David agreed, and realized it down that Victoria had done more than build a business empire or survive a difficult divorce. She'd raised a son who believed in the fundamental goodness of family relationships, who chose kindness over conflict, who understood that love was worth fighting for, even when fighting was complicated. As they walked out of the Palmer House Hotel into the Chicago night, David understood that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Tomorrow, he would still be a janitor working night shifts to pay for his daughter's education. But he would also be Uncle David, the man who'd helped his sister remember that she was worthy of love, the man who'd chosen forgiveness over pride and family over safety. The city lights blurred past the windows of Victoria's car as they drove toward her Gold Coast home, and David realized that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the simplest decisions. He'd said yes to helping a mother protect her child's faith in love, and that simple yes had led him back to the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly as they pulled into her driveway. "For tonight, for everything, for coming home." "Thank you," David replied, "for never giving up on the idea that I might come home someday." Marcus was already asleep in the back seat, exhausted by an evening that had given him an uncle and restored his faith in the possibility of family reconciliation. As David carried his nephew toward the house, he thought about Emma, about how proud she would be to learn that her father had found his way back to his sister after 25 years of stubborn silence. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the comfortable chaos of a home where a child was genuinely loved and encouraged to explore his interests. Model airplanes shared shelf space with astronomy books, and crayon drawings of rocket ships decorated the refrigerator alongside Marcus's latest school awards. "This is beautiful," David said, taking in the evidence of the life Victoria had built for herself and her son. "You've made a real home here." "We've made a real home here," Victoria corrected. "And now, maybe it can be home for you too. At least sometimes. I know you have your own life, your own responsibilities, but—" "But family is family," David finished, "and we've wasted enough time pretending otherwise." As Victoria made hot chocolate and Marcus gave David a sleepy tour of his telescope collection, David realized that the evening had provided something much more valuable than a successful performance or a satisfied customer. It had provided a reminder that love was worth the risk of rejection, that family was worth the difficulty of forgiveness, and that sometimes the most important transformations happened not when we changed who we were, but when we remembered who we'd always been. The single dad janitor had indeed done something that stunned everyone, including himself. He'd chosen love over pride, family over safety, and forgiveness over the comfortable distance of mutual estrangement. And in doing so, he'd discovered that the most extraordinary gift he could give wasn't a performance of love, but the real thing, messy, complicated, imperfect, and absolutely genuine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, conversations with Richard about custody, discussions with the board about corporate implications, explanations to Emma about the uncle she'd never known existed. But tonight, David Murphy was exactly where he belonged. Home with his family, surrounded by the love he'd thought he'd lost forever, reminded that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us back to where we started, transformed by the distance we've traveled and grateful for the love that remained constant despite our absence. The pretense was over, The real love story had just begun.